Hi, my name is Rhythma, and today I'm going to be reviewing The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This novel is a standalone novel, which I think is pretty rare in the fantasy genre, and something that really impressed me about this because it's really hard to create a whole new world with good world building, interesting lore, good character development, and have also an interesting plot at the same time. But Samantha Shannon pulls it off, and I think the result was a really interesting, if not totally unique or groundbreaking novel. This probably isn't like my favorite fantasy book of all time. Probably not, probably won't even be my favorite fantasy book of the year, but I think it's a really good book, especially if you're kind of on the fence about fantasy, if you've been wanting to read the genre for a while and you're like, well, I don't want to spend like weeks of my life reading this series that's like 10 books long and each book is 800 pages long. You can just read one book that's 800 pages long and, sort of get the whole fantasy experience. So, the plot of this book is, like I said, not totally groundbreaking. Basically, in this world, there are dragons and wyverns, and the eastern countries of this world venerate dragons and they worship them as gods, whereas the western countries sort of group in dragons with wyverns, and they think that dragons are evil because of the fact that 1,000 years ago there was this evil being called the Nameless One, which I'm not a huge fan of that name. It reminds me a lot of the Dark One from Wheel of Time, which also is just like the most generic name for a bad guy you could ever have. But anyways, the Nameless One is like this super evil guy who wants to subjugate all of humanity, and his minions are called wyverns, and they're quite similar to dragons in that they fly and they look like dragons, kind of, because they're reptilian. But the Western countries are like, wyverns are evil and they look like dragons, thus dragons are evil. And so there's no contact between the Eastern and the Western countries, but the story is sort of like the development of how the four main characters, two of which are in the Eastern countries and two of which are in the Western countries, and it's sort of like the development of how the Eastern Western countries end up coming together and uniting against the threat against humanity, which is the Nameless One. So, like I said, I mentioned Wheel of Time earlier, and I think that if you took 98% of the world building and subplots of the Wheel of Time, like not even 98%, like 99% of the world building and subplots, and you just chopped them out and you condensed it into one book, this is probably the kind of book you would get, where the world building is pretty basic and straightforward. The Western countries are basically like your standard medieval European like world building where everyone, there's lords and ladies. And the interesting sort of tweak I thought in this book was that there's a queendom instead of a kingdom. And so, yeah, like the Eastern countries are basically just like in ancient China and Japan, but dragons are real. So, like I said, the world building is not the most exciting aspect of this novel, but I did enjoy that bit of lore of the queendom, because basically they believe that if the queendom's like bloodline is what's keeping the Nameless One at bay. And so that becomes a huge source of conflict in this novel, because the current queen hasn't been married and doesn't have any children. So if she dies before giving birth to a child, they all believe that like the Nameless One is going to, break free of his prison. And so yeah, that I thought it was a really interesting aspect of this novel was the lore. And the more we learn about the lore, the more like sort of intriguing it gets, because we learn like, is that even true that the queens are the ones that keep the Nameless One at bay, or is there something else that was going on, or like what actually happened when the Nameless One was put into his like prison? And so, yeah, discovering that was probably my favorite part of this novel, and I really, really appreciated the lore and like the way that it was revealed. It wasn't revealed all at once. It was kind of like a mystery of like unwrapping each different aspect, and like all four characters, all four main characters sort of like discover a different part, but you as the reader are like able to put it together, and I really, really enjoyed that. So I guess I should talk about who the four main characters are. Two of them are set in the Western countries, and two of them are set in the Eastern country. And so Iad is a lady's maid to the queen, and she's sort of part of like the outer inner circle of the queen as her lady's maid. And as her backstory is super intriguing. She's like an assassin, but she's not there to kill the queen. She's there to protect the queen because, so basically she like comes from the secret organization, and they're like, well, we don't know if the queen's bloodline actually is keeping the nameless one at bay, but like just to be safe, we're gonna send you, and your job is to protect the queen. And so I thought that was really interesting. And as her relationship with the queen develops, it's really sweet and very tender. And yeah, the other character who's set in the West, his name is Arteloth, and Arteloth is also friend to Iad and also the queen. But at the beginning of the novel, he's been sent away from the queendom because there are certain factions within the queen's court who are suspicious of Arteloth's relationship with the queen, and people are worried that it might be romantic, which again, since the queen hasn't been married yet, her marriage has to be like a politically advantageous marriage. And so she's not at liberty to marry whoever she wants. And so Arteloth has been sent away because he's kind of seen as like a distraction to the queen. And so he's been sent away, and I would describe Arteloth as like a good guy. He's really faithful. He prays every day, and like he's just a good guy. I really loved his character. He's not the most interesting character, but I loved him, and I think it's good to have like it's always nice to have a character who's just good, you know? In the East, we have Tane, who is a dragon rider in training. She's kind of like that character, the underdog who's got a little something to prove. She's an orphan. She comes from like a poor village, but she's been selected to study and become a dragon rider if she can, pass the tests and the trials. And so she kind of has a chip on her shoulder, and it was really fun reading her chapters just because she's one of those characters who's like, oh, I gotta prove myself, and I gotta like, show everyone what I've got. Yeah, the idea of being a dragon rider has always fascinated me since I was a child, so I loved her chapters a lot. But my favorite character of all had to be Niklaus. Now, Niklaus is like a very morally ambiguous character. He's not exactly bad, but he's really, really selfish, and that combination led to like one of my favorite monologues in the whole book. I mean, once you get to it, it's towards the end, but once you get to it, you'll know what I'm talking about because it was just so good. And so yeah, Niklaus is an alchemist. He is not from the Eastern country. He was actually banished there by the current queen. He told the queen that he can make her a elixir of immortality, and once the queen kind of caught on to his bullshit, she banishes him to the Eastern countries, and he can never go home, and he's super bitter about it. He provides like a really good counterpoint to Arteloth, who is like good to like a fault. And then you have Niklaus, who is kind of like morally ambiguous and doesn't really give a shit about other people. And he just wants to survive. He just wants to go home to his home country, but he can't because he's been banished. And so he's just like trying to do whatever he can to get back home. And I think it makes for like a really realistic character. Most people who if they were in his shoes, they would kind of act the same way. So I really like sort of related to him almost, and I really enjoyed his character. He doesn't have like the most exciting chapters either, but it was really entertaining to read. And so yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. It's probably a little choppy and not super coherent at times, but I'm excited to film more book reviews and get better at talking to the camera and get better at putting my thoughts into a coherent sentence. So thank you so much for watching if you stayed here till the end, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!